any strategy going forward.
Thank you. Can I just ask, Nicole raised the point around security of funding. How's that reflected in Wales? Are you facing those same challenges, or is it a different setup for you?
It's definitely the same challenges, and what we've done to address some of those challenges is when we had a sustainable funding group, which was made up from commissioners and stakeholders, we looked at a commissioning guidance which they informed, and it was developed, etc. But I chair the VORG equivalent, if you like, commissioners group, which I've set up because there's a real desire and demand by commissioners to look at what more they need to do, and there is no funding pot which is endless. So it's about better collaboration, improved coordination across those departments, and also working towards a blueprint of services that should be available for victims irrespective of where they live in Wales. So there is actually considerable work in progress in this area around how we can be better informed about what those needs are, where those gaps are, and where those priorities should be through a dedicated commissioners group which we've set up in Wales.
Thank you. And Sophie Linden, if I can come to you on the wider strategy point.
Sure, thank you. Before I get onto that, can I just give you an example to exemplify the problem around the funding issue?
Yeah, of course.
You know, recently the Home Office in the last couple of weeks have announced a fairly small funding pot for services to tackle perpetrators. Really welcome to have that funding pot. Yesterday, I had to have a meeting with my officials in MOPAC to discuss how do we cope with this, because we have to have bids in by August and all the money has to be spent in this financial year. Now that is just no way to run serious programmes to tackle perpetrators or to serious programmes to support victims. Fundamental problems in that. You can't get, you know, it's very difficult to set up and, you know, deliver the programme so quickly. There's a problem for the workforce. So that's just one example of funding pots and funding streams exemplified, not just from the Home Office, from the Ministry of Justice across the country. But in terms of the strategy, the last government's Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, I mean, there has been a lot of progress. I can't deny that, and that's really welcome. We've got Nicole as Domestic Abuse Commissioner. We've got really, you know, a new domestic abuse bill, even though, you know, doesn't go as far as everybody wanted. We wanted it to go. So there has been real progress, but you can see from the things it set out to do that it hasn't succeeded in everything. For example, in criminal justice outcomes, we've already had the figures on domestic abuse detections being woefully low. We know the problem with the rape prosecutions as well. But also, one of the things it set out to do was this cross-government response to violence against women and girls. During the pandemic, just another example of how difficult that is. I and other police and crime commissioners around the country went to government to say, we know there's going to be a problem. We can learn from abroad there's going to be a problem with domestic abuse and violence against women and girls during the pandemic. What do we do to step up the services? We had to trail from the Ministry of Local Government to the Home Office to the Ministry of Justice. There was not a coordinated response. So for me, that's what I really want to see, a really robust coordinated response coming out of the government's next Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. And really importantly, I don't want to see a separate domestic abuse, and I don't think the sector wants to see a separate domestic abuse strategy, because we need to look at violence against women and girls in the round. But, you know, if you are often a domestic abuse victim, is also a rape victim, and having those two strategies separate I don't feel will provide these services, the support, and the actual the focus that is needed. So that's incredibly important. The two things I really want to see in the strategy coming forward, not just an integrated strategy, but is much more work on perpetrators, as Nicole has suggested. There's been some very good work and innovative work, but we need to have that focus. We need to have the police absolutely focus on the offenders and offender management. And the second thing is on prevention and public space violence. That's what we'll be looking at in refreshing the VORG strategy in London, which I've just set off doing post-election, and that's what I'd like to see in the government's VORG strategy as well.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to you on that point around domestic abuse and wider violence against women and girls. But I'll just go to Claire Waxman to take her views on strategy first, and then I'll come back to that if that's okay. So Claire, over to you.
Thank you. So as we've heard, I mean, the strategy has made some good progress. We obviously had the stalking protection orders and coercive control legislation, and the strategy was meant to overhaul the criminal justice response to vulnerable victims and to really identify those patterns of behaviour and not look at them as single incidents in coercive control and in stalking. But as we know, the prosecution rates are still woefully inadequate. And so there's definitely a gap still between the legislation and what's actually happening in practice. And it's a case of obviously looking at training, but also we need some oversight as well as to why the police are not investigating these cases. We see too many stalking and coercive control cases not being taken forward and not recognising that pattern of behaviour. So that is still an issue that the strategy hasn't been able to resolve. As we've heard, sustainable funding is absolutely critical, especially in light of what we've seen with the pandemic. Those support services that provide a lifeline to victims and survivors are really struggling. There's increased demand on them because they're holding victims and survivors for so much longer due to the criminal justice response taking so many more years for victims to actually get to court. So it's absolutely critical that we look at the sustainable long-term funding so that we can put in place proper support services. And of course, prevention is absolutely critical, as we've talked about. For tackling the root causes of male violence, we need to have a robust perpetrator strategy as well, because we're putting so much onus on victims and survivors to come forward into a very complex and delayed criminal justice process, which is not serving them well. And so we really need to focus on how we tackle and prevent, as opposed to always putting pressure on victims to come forward and report in a system that is obviously incredibly delayed and has a lot of issues delivering justice. So I would say those are sort of my key areas.
Thank you very much for that. I just want to, my last question, I want to go back to Sophie Linden's point around the dual strategy approach. So violence against women and girls and domestic abuse. I'm interested in your view on that and whether you think it's a good thing or not to separate the two out, but also what that means in terms of delivery. So, we know these issues are deeply interconnected, but there are delivery issues connected to them in terms of provision of services, in terms of funding streams. So what's the impact to your mind on the ground from this dual strategy as well?
When I talk to the sector and the providers and those that are working with women and survivors in London, they're really clear in their views that there shouldn't be a separate strategy because they are so interconnected, and that's I take their advice on that, because they understand far more than I do what the consequences are of separating out funding streams, separating out the strategies. In terms of what I think it can also mean in terms of delivery on the ground, you take the Metropolitan Police. They have had separate commands and separate ways of dealing with things. One of the things that the restructuring of the Metropolitan Police in the last couple of years has done is bring that together at a local level with enough expertise at a local level in order to be able to look at the interconnections between the violence that women are suffering. So for me, separating it out creates risks and vulnerabilities. It creates problems for victims and survivors that they will have to possibly go to more than one professional in order to be able to get the help and support they need. And it also, in terms of policing, could be a problem in that a victim has to continually repeat their story. So that's one of the reforms and restructuring the Metropolitan Police has tried to bring that together so that there is a cohesive, coherent response to victims in the way that they present, not saying, well, you need to go to one place because you've been victim of this and another place because you've been a victim of a different type of violence.
Yeah, that's